There are almost no limits to what anime can do, what it can be. Anime can elicit so many different and powerful emotional responses, but one that it really seems to struggle with is fear.
So why doesn't horror work in anime?
But works of genuinely great horror and animation are few and far between.
Bulky anime is always so hit or miss.
Anime isn't real. What happens in visually won't scare us, since we live on a different dimensional plane.
One of the biggest hindrance to horror anime is anime itself.
Feeling anime really struggles to bring up, which is fear.
Good horror anime is actually scary.
I can count the number of anime that have actually scared me as an adult on one hand.
There's a couple issues I have with this whole rhetoric. Yes, contrary to what you may have gathered from the title, this is not one singular problem with the discourse, rather an amalgamation of smaller issues. Though my intention was not to mislead you, I'm sorry, please stay. I chose this title because, and attentive viewers may have recognized, this title is in reference to another video. Mr. Basement's video is a bit of an inspiration for this one. What Jeff sets out to do with this video is point out that anime struggles to induce fear due to the medium that anime is, essentially because animation struggles to replicate realism and is not as interactive as a game, book, or comic would be. Inducing fear through visuals is easier in live action because it already captures realism and is cheaper to produce than an animation would be. The reason this is less of an issue with books, games, or comics is because they require active participation and have an extra layer of investment as a result. I agree with these points generally, but this is already the commonly accepted opinion, and the reasoning behind this opinion has already been explained many times prior. This isn't egregious on its own or anything, but it's in the details where I take issue. There are many moments in the video where statements are presented as if they are infallible when they tend to be more subjective. Many topics skimmed past, leaving counter-arguments unaddressed. This and also there are specific examples not mentioned whatsoever, even though these examples may be suitable rebuttals to some arguments. He doesn't even acknowledge Higurashi no Nakokoro ni, the most commonly known, well-regarded, and definitive horror anime. But that aside, I want to look at Perfect Blue for an example of a rebuttal. It's one of the closest examples of aesthetic realism we currently have with horror anime. There's so much attention to detail in creating a lived-in world. The character designs tend to be less cartoony, and it's shot in ways very similar to how a live-action film would be. This is worth acknowledging when one of the main points is that anime fails to replicate realism. But we'll never know what Jeff has to say about that, as he never bears it mention. These examples are a dime a dozen, and I don't want to focus on every single detail, otherwise I'll be here all day. But the deeper I dove into this video and discussed how I felt about it with others, the more I realized that it just opened up more questions about horror anime and our perception of it in general. For one, is Perfect Blue even a horror? If it's not, what examples are horror? Are these examples commonly agreed upon? What the hell defines what isn't and isn't a horror anyway? Now, I'm going to level with you. I really don't like arguing about genre, especially when the genre in question is very broad in its definition. But the more I discuss horror with others, particularly within the anime community, I find that nobody really agrees on what is and isn't horror.
Today we are looking at a series that is not technically horror, but it shares a lot of the same expectations. It's more of a supernatural mystery.
Let's revisit the question of whether or not Perfect Blue is a horror. The most common argument against that is that Perfect Blue is more of a psychological thriller than it is a horror. And that's fair enough, honestly. But I think it's worth considering some things. Thriller and horror as genres constantly overlap. Thrillers are more about immediate action or threats, intending to create feelings of suspense, confusion, and so on. Horror doesn't necessarily need to be about immediacy, but still can be. All that defines horror is that it should invoke feelings of fear, unease, dread, and or disgust. In terms of commonalities in horror, they tend to include violence and gore as well. So while yes, Perfect Blue does have a lot of suspenseful and disorienting scenes that left me on the edge of my seat in anticipation, and therefore suits the definition of a thriller, Perfect Blue also has many scenes that induce dread, unease, and contain violent scenes that are genuinely rough to watch, such as the that screwdriver scene. A thriller can still be a thriller without containing elements that a horror would. In the same vein, a horror can be a horror without containing elements of a thriller. But Perfect Blue contains traits from both genres. So then, in my eyes, it's just a psychological horror and thriller. Now imagine going through that rundown with every other horror anime in existence. Shiki's much more of a mystery than it is a horror, honestly. Oh, The Promised Neverland? That's not a horror. To be fair, I've been guilty of this with Gakugurashi as well. I think there's a problem, though, when I can only think of one well-respected anime that everyone agrees is a true horror. That being Higurashi. And guess what? Even Higurashi is a bit of a mystery. By the second season, it almost completely drops its horror atmosphere and feels like a different show. All of these examples contain horror elements and absolutely depend on these elements to work properly. Horror is deeply ingrained in all of these examples, but there are often disagreements surrounding these shows and their place in the genre. I mean, it's no wonder there's no good horror anime when any potential examples are locked behind other genre definitions. The scope of what the community considers this already niche genre in anime is so incredibly small. But horror imagery, themes, atmosphere, and so on are actually very, very prevalent. What would Attack on Titan be without its uncanny humanoid titular giants? What would Madoka Magica be without the death, suffering, or existential nightmare of being a magical girl? What would Eden of Evangelion be without its body horror, excessive blood, and downright unsettling imagery? Now, would I call these examples horror anime? Not necessarily, no. But I also feel there's no reason we shouldn't at least consider discussing them among true horror anime. There's value in recognizing strong examples even when they don't completely commit to fitting in the genre. But this begs the question, where does one draw the line? I use the examples of Attack on Titan, Madoka Magica, and End of Evangelion because these examples are kind of pushing it. But when one looks back on some previously mentioned anime, like Shiki, Gakugurashi, or Perfect Blue, these seem to be more accurate examples by contrast. However, there's another catch. I selected these examples not just because I find them to be good horror anime, but because these are also very different examples of horror. Sure, they all share some commonalities, such as violence, dreadful atmosphere, and ability to elicit similar uncomfortable emotions, etc. But you will find completely different experiences with each. Gakugurashi creates horror through dissonance inside a narrative of avoiding reality. Shiki creates horror by analyzing human nature, mob mentality, and creating a scenario where death and murder is an inevitability with no alternative solution. Perfect Blue creates horror through the loss of control, editing that bends reality, and explores the dark side of celebrity and fan culture. What I want to illustrate with this is that there's more going on here than scares. All of these examples, as different as they are, all intend to take the viewer to some dark places, areas of the mind where other genres just do not take you. Gakugurashi left me feeling like I shouldn't be enjoying escapism. It had me questioning when reality would come crashing down around me and whether or not I would be able to face it. Shiki left me with an empty feeling, a reminder that human nature creates cyclical violence, death, dehumanization, and so on. Perfect Blue left me questioning how much control I had over my own life and whether or not I was truly aware of what was going on at any given time, also that the public's idea of my image is not something I'm in control of. This is what I go to horror for. I don't find anything scary in the sense that there is a direct, tangible threat. And the reason I think people are so hesitant to describe something as horror is because this is what is implied. Expectations of the horror genre immediately form this idea that what you're going to watch will leave you checking over your shoulder, will leave you closing the blinds and fearing the ghosts or undead axe murderers. But this is a very simple and somewhat accurate idea of what to expect from a horror. Many horror do fit into this description, but not all horror has to. And I don't think anime specifically is trying to fall into that super specific definition and wants to explore horror through other genres. I think the creative minds behind anime understand the tools they're working with and realize that horror in animation is at a disadvantage on a technical level. This is why the majority of horror you will find in anime is usually a subgenre or pairs more evenly with other genres. I also find horror tends to be more effective when it's hidden. Our idea of what a horror will bring as a genre creates a subconscious defense when looking through a piece of horror media. Knowing that the genre tends to provoke feelings we don't necessarily want to feel means that scares won't necessarily land. We're overly prepared. That is why I find horror to be more effective as subgenre almost inherently. and that is why I believe a majority of the good horror anime tends to fall into this gray area of genre definition. Now, I still haven't answered the question, where do we draw the line in determining what is and isn't a horror? But I'm not so sure myself, honestly, and even more so, I'm not sure how much that even matters. The reason I hate arguing about genre definition is that it always comes down to drawing a line at a pool of gray. Everyone is going to have a different idea of what horror is, and there is not one singular agreed upon answer necessarily. Defining horror has been a long argued topic in general. The best we can accomplish is forming the strongest definition. Horror, the word, is defined as an intense feeling of fear, shock, or disgust. Intense feelings of dismay or dislike. Also, an attack of extreme nervousness or anxiety. So then the horror genre should provoke these feelings, and for something to fall into that genre definition, primarily, it should be consistently doing so. Therefore, I think it's fair to say a movie like Perfect Blue, and shows like The Promised Neverland and Gakko fit this definition and should be discussed among horror anime on the whole. Though, as will consistently be the case with anime overall, not every example will stick to the same tone and will dip into other genres at one point or another. And it's because of this that I feel there's contention around defining some of these examples as horror. The reason I initially didn't want to describe Gakko as a horror is because I felt it set specific expectations and that the show held up better if approached as a slice of life first and as a horror second. But while I understand the reasoning, that doesn't change what the show is. The larger issue is that our expectations of what a horror provides is much more limited than what is actually the case. Now then, let's reiterate my main points. There are more shows and movies that should be discussed among other horror anime. Many of these examples are accomplishing what the community bemoans horror anime lacks. There are also several well-loved and respected anime that would not be without their use of horror. Much of what the community wants from horror anime is being served up already, but not in a way that the community acknowledges. Also, our expectations for horror create a much more specific idea than what horror is capable of. I will admit that anime struggles with inducing fear specifically, but there is so much more to horror beyond that, and it seems many fans would agree considering how many praise series for being dark and containing horrifying imagery. I don't know if we'll ever get a significant true blue horror anime, but as far as I'm concerned, I don't really need one. Of course, the more the merrier, but I already have 2 horror anime in my top 10. I love many shows that rely on horror as subgenre, contain dark atmosphere and themes, or burned memorable horrifying images into my skull. Maybe I'm just complicit and already have a preference for the aesthetic and themes of horror, but that doesn't mean I want to just sit on my hands, let things remain as they are, and not talk about it. In regards to the Jeff video specifically, I realized that the issue wasn't so much Jeff misinterpreting things or selling his opinion as fact, but that so few people actually took issues with it. I'd like to cover many of the shows Jeff talked about in the video, and I'll likely address some of his points in those videos. Because in actuality, the biggest issue I have with horror anime discourse is that there's not enough of it. As a result of that, the community just accepts what we do have and contributes to spreading these common takes without questioning them or building off of them. The solution to the problem is to begin furthering the discussion. So be on the lookout for videos about some of these shows on screen right now in the near future, whether it be thematic breakdown, scene analysis, or whatever I decide to talk about. I want to give horror anime the attention it deserves.